500 years, the body of one of them has been missing.
An anonymous car park in Leicester was about to yield its secret.
Most infamous monarch, Richard III.
For 10 years, the Richard III discovery was the feel-good archaeogenetic miracle. A king found under a parking lot, a dynasty confirmed, a mystery wrapped in a neat academic bow. That version was safe and misleading. Because the real story, the part they downplayed in 2014, wasn't the rediscovery of a king. It was the collapse of his bloodline. One test confirmed the skeleton, the other test destroyed the dynasty. And the latest 2025 Reanalysis didn't clarify the controversy. It blew the last escape hatch off its hinges. The York line wasn't broken somewhere, it was broken at the root. And that means the bloodline that launched the Wars of the Roses wasn't just tainted. It never existed. If you think you know this story, you don't. Because the real scandal isn't in the bones. It's in the DNA they were too careful to announce. Philippa Langley wasn't supposed to find anything. Definitely not a king. Definitely not on day one. Definitely not in a place as humiliating as a council parking lot surrounded by office blocks and oil stains. Yet the bones appeared. Tangled, twisted, shoved into a grave too small for the body. A burial that screamed disrespect. 10 wounds, 8 to the skull. 2 fatal. Then the spine. A 70+ degree curve. Not the monstrous caricature Tudor propaganda invented, but the unmistakable adolescent scoliosis that matched Richard's descriptions exactly. Archaeology lined everything up. Diet, age, injuries, status, era. By the end of 2012, the evidence pointed to one answer. By 2014, the mitochondrial DNA confirmed it. Case closed. But then the second test, the Y-chromosome, blew the floor out from under the celebration. Richard's paternal signature didn't match the modern male descendants of Edward III. It didn't match the accepted Plantagenet line. It didn't match anyone who should have been related to him. The 2014 team wrapped that in cautious, academic language. Possible break somewhere in 19 generations. A polite footnote, a gentle shrug. But the new 2025 long-read sequencing left no wiggle room. The paternal break wasn't somewhere. It was exactly where no one wanted it. Between Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and his supposed son Richard, Duke of York. If you want history without the safety filter, subscribe to Root and Relic, because what comes next doesn't just rewrite a king's story, it rewrites the war that reshaped England. The trench was barely open when the impossible happened. Human legs, angled wrong. Dumped, not buried. 6 feet down in clay, packed by centuries of pressure, they found a grave too short for the body. The head was forced upward, jammed like an afterthought. No coffin, no shroud, no care. This wasn't a king's burial. It was a disposal. Then the bones told the real story. 10 wounds, 8 to the skull. 2 instantly fatal. A sword had opened the base of the skull. A halberd punched straight through the top, a finishing strike delivered to a fallen noble. These weren't random battlefield hits. These were kill confirmations. Then came the detail that froze every expert. The spine. A severe scoliosis curve. About 70 to 75 degrees. Enough to raise one shoulder, but not enough to cripple a fighter. Not a deformity, a condition. The diet sealed the profile. High delta, 13C, and delta 15N values. Fish, wine, expensive protein. A high-status life. Age? Right. Wounds? Right. Spine? Right. Diet? Right. Everything pointed to one conclusion. This was a king, dumped by enemies who wanted him forgotten. Archaeology gave the identity. DNA would decide the truth. Most DNA is chaos across centuries, until recombined, shuffled, scrambled. But mitochondrial DNA doesn't play that game. It passes from mother to child like a signature that refuses to fade. Richard III had no surviving legitimate children. But Anne of York, his sister, had a line that never broke. Genealogists traced it across 17 generations. Hard evidence, wills, parish registers, marriage records, land transfers, every leap accounted for. 2 living descendants remained. Michael Ibsen and Wendy Duldig. In a sterile clean room, scientists drilled into the tooth and femur, the safest vaults, for ancient DNA. Masks, sealed suits, UDG treatment to remove damaged bases, indexing to prevent contamination. Then the sequence came in. A perfect match. mtDNA, haplogroup J1C2C. Rare in Europe, unmistakable when it appears. The skeleton under the parking lot wasn't just similar. It was identical to Anne of York's modern descendants. Case closed, identity confirmed. But the next test wasn't about identity. It was about legitimacy, and this is where the ground cracked open. If mtDNA is the quiet whisper of ancestry, the Y-chromosome is the megaphone, fathers to sons to grandsons, an unbroken chain stretching across centuries. Richard III should have carried the same Y-chromosome as the male descendants of Edward III, the Plantagenet patriarch. He didn't. Not close, not almost, not could be. Richard's inferred haplogroup was GP287. The modern Somerset descendants, direct male line heirs of Edward III, carried R1BU152. These lineages diverged thousands of years before the Middle Ages. There is no model, no mutation rate, no genealogical path that connects them. This wasn't a random blip. This wasn't contamination. This wasn't a clerical error. It was a paternal break, a false father, a genetic rupture. The 2014 team buried it under cautious language. Possible non-paternity event, somewhere in 19 generations. A footnote designed to protect reputations. But the 2025 long-read sequencing ripped away the ambiguity. The burn wasn't somewhere, it was precise. It was catastrophic. And it wasn't after Richard. It was before him, inside his own family tree. The Y chromosome didn't just mismatch. It exposed the dynasty's original lie. For centuries, historians treated one rumor like trash, a political smear, a Tudor invention, a weapon in a propaganda war. The rumor said this: Richard, Duke of York, father of kings, backbone of the Yorkist claim, wasn't his father's son. Enemies whispered that Cecily Neville cheated, that she conceived while her husband, the Earl of Cambridge, was away, that the child looked too handsome, too unlike his father, suspiciously well-favored. They even named the alleged biological father, an archer called Blaborn. Nobody believed it because nobody wanted to believe it. It was too convenient, too political, too medieval. But here's the problem. The DNA now says the rumor wasn't fiction. Richard III's Y chromosome does not match Edward III's male line. The Somerset line, which is Edward III's male line, matches Gaunt, matches each other, matches the pre-break signature. Richard III doesn't. So the one rumor historians dismissed as fantasy suddenly looks like a distorted reflection of an inconvenient truth. Something happened in Cecily Neville's household. Something nobody wrote down. Something nobody admitted. And it didn't just stain one family. It detonated a dynasty. In 2014, the team had the mismatch. They could see the break, but they didn't know where it came from. Short-read sequencing wasn't enough. It gave them fragments, tiny shards of ancient DNA glued together by algorithmic guesswork. So the official paper wrapped the anomaly in academic padding. Possible false paternity. Somewhere. Cannot determine location. Translation: it's bad, but we're not ready to say how bad. Then came 2025. Long-read genomic sequencing changed the game. It can read ancient DNA in continuous strands, tens of thousands of bases long, not shattered pieces. It can trace paternal markers with precision the 2014 team couldn't dream of. A new team reopened the case. University of Leicester Harvard's Ancient DNA Unit Max Planck Institute. Independent geneticists with no reason to soften results. And they asked the one question 2014 avoided. Whose Y chromosome is the real Plantagenet signature? Not Richard III's, not the Somersets, Edward III's. To answer that, they needed a sample older than the break, older than the Yorkists, older than the 15th century. They got permission from Westminster Abbey, a microscopic sample from the tomb of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. When his DNA came back, everything aligned instantly. John of Gaunt to the Somersets, to the modern Somerset men, the same Y line. Richard III was not part of it. The Plantagenet Y chromosome wasn't missing. Richard's was, and that allowed the 2025 team to pinpoint the exact rupture between Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and the child who was supposed to be his son. Not a guess, not a range, a single generation. The break didn't drift for 500 years. It happened once, right where the rumor always said it did. This is the part the historian crowd hates, because it flips the entire Wars of the Roses upside down. If Richard, Duke of York, wasn't the Earl of Cambridge's son, then the chain reaction is unavoidable. Edward IV, illegitimate by blood. The charismatic conqueror, not a Plantagenet. The princes in the Tower, illegitimate by blood. Their claim wasn't weak, it didn't exist. Richard III, illegitimate by blood. His obsession with true lineage collapses into irony. The entire York dynasty, biologically false. A royal house built on a father who wasn't the father. And then comes the sledgehammer. The Wars of the Roses, the bloodiest dynastic war in English history, was fought over a rightful claim that never existed. Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury, dozens of noble houses destroyed, tens of thousands dead, all because one family believed their blood was purer, older, closer to Edward III. The DNA says they were wrong. The York line wasn't the rightful branch. It wasn't a flawed branch. It wasn't a branch at all. Richard III lost his crown at Bosworth. But the 2025 study takes something much bigger. It erases the foundation of his dynasty. The Wars of the Roses have always been framed as a battle of rightful bloodlines. York claiming purity, Lancaster claiming legitimacy. A civil war built on ancestry. But once you remove the Yorkist myth, the entire conflict collapses into something far more brutal. A 30-year slaughter fought over a mistake. The York claim, the one repeated in every textbook, depended entirely on Richard, Duke of York, being the true male line descendant of Edmund of Langley. He wasn't. So every Yorkist justification falls apart. The rebellion against Henry VI, built on a false genealogy. Edward IV, seizing the crown, built on a false inheritance. The battles of Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury, entire noble houses wiped out defending a bloodline that science says didn't exist. Look at the numbers now, without the myth. Towton, about 28,000 dead in a single snowstorm of slaughter. Barnet, the Yorkist victory that killed the only Lancastrian commander who truly threatened Edward IV. Tewkesbury, the massacre that ended the Lancastrian royal line. Every corpse on those battlefields believed they were fighting for the heir with the purer claim. They weren't. They were fighting for a fiction constructed by a mistake in one household. And the irony? The Lancastrians, portrayed as usurpers, turn out to have been the only side carrying the true male line signature of Edward III. History didn't just misjudge a king. It misread an entire war. The Yorkists weren't the rightful heirs, they were the loudest ones. If the break happened between the Earl of Cambridge and the baby raised as Richard, Duke of York, then one person sits at the center of the storm. Cecily Neville, the Rose of Arabia, a duchess with more political influence than most men in her era. And suddenly her life looks very different. Not scandalous, complicated. Possibility 1. The affair. The classic accusation. Enemies said she conceived while her husband was away. Easy to weaponize, easy to exaggerate, too convenient to trust. But too convenient doesn't mean impossible. And DNA no longer lets historians dismiss it outright. Possibility 2. Wartime vulnerability. Women left alone in massive households while men fought. Armies marching. Retainers shifting loyalties. Noble women weren't protected, they were exposed. A pregnancy under those conditions wouldn't be whispered. It would be buried. Possibility 3. Silent adoption or baby substitution. Medieval households were chaotic ecosystems. Wet nurses, servants, fosterlings, orphans. Infant mortality was brutal. Substitution happened. Quietly. Without record. A noble line losing a newborn heir. A spare infant of similar age in the household. Stranger things happened, documented in multiple aristocratic families. Possibility 4. Misrecorded paternity, not misconduct. Births weren't observed, certified, notarized. If a child looked healthy, he was accepted. Legitimacy was social, not biological. What the 2025 DNA exposes isn't Cecily the adulteress. It exposes Cecily, the political survivor navigating a reality where women had no margin for error. She became the accidental mother of a dynasty built on a genetic ghost, not because she wanted to rewrite history, but because medieval life wrote history that way, and because nobody in the 15th century could imagine a technology that would one day reveal the truth buried in their bones. Edward IV, the giant, the warrior, the battlefield genius, becomes a different figure once the genetic truth is laid over his life. Because now, his reign looks less like triumph and more like concealment. He projected strength, 6'4", a near-mythic fighter, a charismatic presence that electrified England. But charisma is a shield, not a claim. He married in secret, twice. First Eleanor Butler, then Elizabeth Woodville. Historians dismiss the first marriage as rumor, but the second, a lightning-fast private marriage without witnesses, is bizarre for a king secure in his lineage. A man certain of his bloodline doesn't scramble to tie himself to powerful families. A man with doubt does. He punished rivals with precision, deadly when challenged. Overly generous to loyalists, terrified of cracks in his support. That's not stability, that's compensation. He obsessed over successors. A king confident in his bloodline doesn't panic. Edward did, repeatedly. And then comes the detail everyone ignored for 500 years. Richard III publicly claimed Edward once admitted he doubted his own parentage. Not theatrics, not Shakespeare. A legal argument used by Richard in 1483, dismissed for centuries because historians couldn't imagine any truth behind it. Now they can. The 2025 DNA turns that accusation from absurd to plausible to likely. Edward IV didn't just fight to defend his dynasty. He fought to protect the one thing he feared most, the truth buried inside his own blood. Richard III is easy to hate when you read Shakespeare. Easy to fear when you read Tudor propaganda. Easy to dismiss when you only see the villain. But Richard's real story becomes terrifyingly human when you factor in one possibility the DNA forces us to confront. Richard III may have been the only York who didn't know the family secret, until he suddenly did. Imagine the moment the truth hit him. Maybe someone whispered it after Edward's death. Maybe Cecily Neville confessed before dying. Maybe Richard connected the dots the moment he saw irregularities in his own lineage. Or maybe a court rumor he'd always ignored suddenly became too sharp to overlook. Either way, something snapped. Because once Richard realized the Yorkist male line might be false, everything he ever believed collapsed beneath his feet. His father? Not his father. His brother Edward IV? Not rightful king. His nephews? Not heirs. His own claim? Built on nothing. Now look at his actions through that lens. The throne grab? Not ambition. A desperate attempt to stop a lineage he believed was genetically wrong. The titulus regius? A legal weapon forged by a man suddenly obsessed with proper lineage because he realized his family's claim was rotten. The princes in the tower? Not simple tyranny, a possible attempt to erase the final evidence of a broken bloodline. Richard wasn't trying to take power. He was trying to purify a dynasty he believed had been contaminated for decades, long before he was even born. Does this justify what happened to the princes? No, but it reveals the psychology of a man cornered by a truth he had no tools to handle. Richard III didn't lose his mind. His world lost its foundation, and he acted like a man trying to rebuild a collapsing identity with the only tools he had left: law, force, and silence. The 2025 study proves there was a false paternity event. It does not prove adultery. It does not prove deception. It does not prove motive. A non-paternity event can come from many paths: consensual infidelity, coerced circumstances, silent adoption, infant substitution, misattributed paternity caused by household chaos, clerical errors, wartime displacement. History is messy. Biology is blunt. Even with long-read sequencing, ancient DNA has limits. Contamination still happens. Allelic dropout distorts fragments. Some genomic regions fail to amplify. Environmental damage skews sequencing bias. Preservation varies from bone to bone. Coverage depth is never perfectly even. The 2025 data is extraordinarily strong, but it is not divine judgment. And medieval legitimacy had nothing to do with genetics. A child recognized by a noble father was legitimate by law. Parliament, the church, and the crown stood on that rule. but medieval power revolved around the belief in pure male line descent. So when that symbolic purity collapses, even centuries later, the foundation of Yorkist authority collapses with it. DNA reveals the biological truth. History reveals the political truth. The damage comes when those two truths collide. If the Somerset line carries the true Y-chromosome of Edward III and the York line does not, the entire logic of medieval succession flips. Edward IV was never the rightful king by blood. His victories, his laws, his coronations, all built on a misidentified ancestry. His sons had no biological claim. Their disappearance becomes even darker because the stakes weren't political. They were existential. Richard III had no rightful claim either. Every justification for taking the crown dissolves. The White Rose dynasty becomes a historical accident, a dynasty founded on a mistake the entire kingdom accepted as truth. Now the nuclear conclusion. If the York line was illegitimate, the Tudor victory at Bosworth wasn't rebellion, it was correction. Henry VII didn't topple rightful heirs. He crushed a dynasty that never had a biological claim at all. And the shockwaves travel forward in time. The Tudors lead to the Stuarts. The Stuarts lead to the Hanoverians. The Hanoverians lead to the Windsors. Modern monarchy rests on political continuity. Medieval monarchy rested on male line purity. The DNA shows that purity was broken before the Yorks ever rose to power. So who should have been king? If we follow biology, the Somerset line. If we follow politics, the victors. If we follow history, the story collapses. And the crown looks like it has stood on a cracked foundation since the 1440s. Richard III wasn't the ending. He was the beginning. Once the 2025 Reanalysis exposed the Yorkist break with forensic precision, universities across Europe stopped playing safe. They began asking the questions monarchies hoped would stay buried. If the Plantagenets hid a secret for 500 years, what about everyone else? Royal tombs, once treated as untouchable, became scientific targets. Westminster Abbey, St. Denis, the Habsburg crypts, the Escorial. Doors sealed forever began to look temporary. Long-read sequencing could now read ancient DNA in uninterrupted strands, detect false paternity with near certainty, map kinship across centuries, and expose dynastic myths that textbooks protected. And that sent tremors through royal institutions. Should the Stuarts be tested? Their line is riddled with paternity rumors. Should the Tudors be tested? Henry VII built legitimacy on victory, not blood. Should the princes in the Tower be tested? One sequencing could rewrite England's darkest mystery. Should modern monarchies allow full ancestral verification? If not, what exactly are they protecting? The Richard III study cracked the door. The 2025 Reanalysis shoved it wide open. Now the question isn't whether royal DNA hides more secrets. It's how many and who gets exposed next. We are entering a future where history isn't shielded. It's audited. By sequencers, by proteomics, by bone chemistry, by data that doesn't bow to crowns or reputations. Kings wrote the past. Science rewrites it. Richard III's bones answered who the skeleton belonged to. The DNA answered something darker. Was the king ever who we thought he was? The findings didn't revise a chapter. They cracked the foundation beneath entire dynasties. The Yorkist bloodline wasn't pure. The Wars of the Roses weren't righteous. The princes weren't heirs. Edward IV wasn't the rightful successor. Richard III wasn't fixing a succession crisis. He was trapped inside one. The story everyone learned, York versus Lancaster, rightful versus corrupt, collapses the moment the genome files open. DNA isn't political, it isn't loyal. It isn't afraid of reputations or legacies. It speaks the truth medieval England killed to conceal. If you want more stories where archaeology exposes myth and DNA drags centuries of lies into the light, subscribe to Root and Relic. And answer this honestly. Should every royal house in the world submit to full genetic testing? Or are some truths still too dangerous to uncover?